Hi, everybody, and welcome to Neuroscientists Talk Shop, UTSA's neuroscience research podcast. Today is January 30th, and we're talking to Katya,
yes.
Likhtic, who is associate professor in the biology department at Hunter City University of New York.
Yep.
Katya's lab studies the brain mechanisms of responses to threat and safety, and all the things connected with that include learned and unlearned anxiety and fear. And if you follow the podcast, you know that we're going to be talking about the amygdala and the cortical regions that connect to it. So hold on. Here we go. And hi, Katya, and thanks for joining us.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
And also with us is Tony Burgos-Robles, our local expert on almost exactly these same things. Hi, Tony.
Howdy.
And also with us is Itamar Lerner,
Hi.
who regular listeners will also recognize. And his lab studies sleep and emotional learning, including fear, and I imagine that's the connection.
That's the connection, correct.
And I'm your host, Charlie Wilson. So it usually seems to us in our experience that fear is something special. It's not like everything else that we learn. It's not like every other emotion. It seems more primitive somehow and primordial. And learning fear is a little different from the way we learn other things. And so are there, from a perspective of the brain mechanisms of learning, are there a unique set of mechanisms that are responsible for fear learning that cause it to seem so unique to us? Or is fear just another thing we learn like all the other stuff that we learn from a brain circuits point of view?
Sure. I would answer that by saying yes and no. So yes, I think yes, it's special in the sense that the amygdala, right, which is or the nuclei that are part of the amygdala, are particularly well preserved across species, and is in fact considered kind of like the archicortex in the sense that it's there even in lizards. Evolutionarily, the amygdala comes from two systems. So from the kind of one of its nuclei systems, the basolateral complex, comes from more of a cortical evolutionary developmental process. And the other one, which is the central amygdala, comes from more of a striatal process. And so from that perspective, it's actually harnessing both types of cellular organizations and systems of communication. So it's very old. And across species, both, again, if we're talking about lizards or rodents or humans or non-human primates, it receives information very quickly, sensory information, and it receives a very rich world of sensory information. And so it's really well poised for making associations, and it seems to be processing aversive information very quickly across the spectrum. So from that perspective, you could say it's a little bit special.
Is it uniquely aversive?
No. So from that perspective, it's not that special, because if you look at even like the earlier work in monkeys that was lesioning the amygdala and looking at what's the effect, right? So like work from the 50s. What you see, the biggest effect is there's the fear aspect of it, but there's also the aspect where animals are just not that good at making associations, at reinforced associations. And it's not just the fear ones. And there's tons of work that shows that there's also rewarding associations that are made in the amygdala. So I would say there is a little bit of a special connection in the sense that the like one trial learning, really quick fear associations really do seem to depend on the amygdala, even though you can still do them with overtraining if you get rid of the amygdala. But it's not special in the sense that it does a lot of learning and associating of information that isn't just fear per se.
Perhaps maybe could argue for the specialty functions of the amygdala, right? But somebody could say, yeah, but those functions are so intermingled with even higher order functions, right? Like, for example, having the subcortical components of the brain, learning about associations of stimuli, right? Some predicting danger, some predicting reward. That information then eventually comes into the critical components of decision making.
Right.
How to behave in the environment. And perhaps, when you put it into that perspective, as Charlie alluded, perhaps a primitive function, but giving rise to more complex functions.
And of course, it's connected with all the most complicated parts of the brain.
Right.
So it's very hard to tease out when you see the amygdala doing something, whether it's doing it in collaboration with some, prefrontal cortex or
hippocampus. If it's doing, for sure, or the entire striatal system, right? So it's certainly not on its own driving fear behavior, and that's it. Like, I think it's a very, very integrated system.
So maybe when we study this circuit, we're using fear conditioning as a kind of just an example of the kind of learning that the amygdala can do? Or do we really think that we've tapped into the essence of the amygdala when we do that?
I think of it as an example, first of all. Second of all, there's certainly nice aspects of the paradigm from just an experimental perspective. It has a fairly clear set of responses that you can quantify. It has a fairly fast learning rate of acquisition. And it has some, nice validity out there in the world from when you're doing experiments in animals, and you can take it to humans very, very nicely. So from those purely experimental reasons that you would want to control things for, I think that's nice. But it's certainly shown to learn many other things. Or like, for example, the extinction of the fear response is also in the amygdala, also occurs there. Learning of associations between cues and rewards has also been shown to occur there, even in situations that are meant to kind of tap into reward learning, that like drug use related reward learning. So it's an example of that kind of learning. When I've seen studies where people look at responses in the amygdala to fearful stimuli or stimuli related to then fearful outcomes or non-fearful outcomes, I think what you see is kind of a salt and pepper representation of both, with certain regions, anatomical regions within the amygdala that are perhaps more driven by the fear stimuli, and then some other regions that are more equally driven by both kinds of stimuli.
Would you consider the amygdala to be a core area that could model relevant aspects of post-traumatic stress disorder?
What do you mean by relevant aspects?
Like, would you say that some of the main symptoms that PTSD patients suffer from are a result of some kind of an aberrant activity in the amygdala, or would you say that it's more dependent on the cortex, right? Memory structures, other than amygdala?
I think it's a combination of amygdala function and amygdala communication with other structures as well as their function. I think that there's, even from our own work, what we see is that after stress, for example, if we look at oscillatory communication, the coherence or the synchrony between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex decreases by a lot. Mm-hmm. And then other people have shown, and in humans, people have shown that the prefrontal cortex is very strongly negatively affected by stress, whereas the amygdala is actually positively affected in the sense that the amygdala almost grows from stress and the prefrontal cortex shrinks from stress, right? So I don't think that you can identify it and say, oh, it's the amygdala it's the amygdala and point the finger and that's it. But the amygdala is part of a highly integrated connective circuit. And I think you can't isolate it and say it's just the amygdala.
Yeah, if I could add, I think it adds to the elegance of the fear conditioning models, right?
Yeah.
From the very beginning. Easy to modulate, manipulate, to quantify behavior, and to try to come up with more meaning for what is impacted actually in the brain in mental disease, right? It's perhaps, in my view, also a combination of things, but also it tells us that perhaps we shouldn't be looking anymore at just one single neural node, but at the entire network, what is happening, not only the amygdala, not only the PFC or hippocampus, but all these theories about how the HPA axis also becomes a crucial component of that sustained anxiety-like behavior and feeling in anxiety disorders. Perhaps, there are obviously some differences in between what PTSD is, which is, experience-based versus generalized anxiety, for example, that you were alluding this morning on your talk. And question I have would be for you, what do you think then is the role of the cortex, right? If we are getting all these important functions from the amygdala. So why is the cortex there? Especially since there's all these theories about, if I may say, higher order functions to try to give sense of what is happening in our world and then help with the decision making or the most appropriate response based on the experience of the world.
I mean, I do think that's what the cortex is doing. I agree with that worldview. I do think the amygdala to me is also it's like a tracker or a machine for tracking aberrant out of something surprising. So like the surprise effect, and it's, and I think it's almost like, I almost think of it as like in vision, if you see something on the side of your peripheral vision and you're like, you don't know where it's coming from, but you are going to turn to it, right? And to me, the amygdala is almost like it's that, but for everything, right? So if something is a little bit surprising or shouldn't have happened or you don't think it should have happened, it's the amygdala, I think, will fire. And then we'll engage whatever it needs to engage. But then it's the role of these other regions, like cortical regions, and the type of parsing that they do, the type of multiplexing that they do of processing cues, differentiating cues, creating kind of these sort of selectivity for what the meaning of the cues are, to then maybe instruct the amygdala to, like, it's fine, things are fine here. But for me, the amygdala is kind of like, it's like something's out of place, let me pay attention.
Answer, it makes sense, back in the day when I was in graduate school, I kind of, use this temporal response of amygdala neurons to come up with a cortical story of driving fear responses, right? Like neural activity in response to threatening cues in the amygdala, they last for a few hundred milliseconds.
It's super quiet structure. Yeah.
It's super fast.
Yeah.
But then in the cortex, you get neural activity changes for many tens of seconds as long as the cues that are predictors of danger are being present. So it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. So the signal to noise in the amygdala is like huge, right? It's very, very quiet. It's under inhibition, very much so. And then something happens. There's a big response, and then it's shut down again. So I think it really is, to me, it's like a flag. Amygdala is just like a big flag raising area,
But within this model, if I could ask, then the information is sent already for cortical higher order processing. Why does it need to come back to the amygdala? Right? basically cortical areas such as the infralimbic cortex you were talking this morning, they send projections back to the amygdala to do what exactly? To control further output of the amygdala? Or
they definitely control further output, right? So if the amygdala is overactive, like in the case of PTSD, you have the overactive amygdala and the underactive prefrontal cortex, right? So it's like you're getting hit from both sides. The idea is that then the prefrontal cortex, from what it knows, will then project to the amygdala and either maybe drive it more, right? Because maybe we think it should, or the prefrontal cortex thinks it should, or maybe it's actually then tapping into circuitry to shut it down. So I think it's partaking in the control, and the pathway is very, very, it's highly reciprocal. And so I think what we definitely don't understand enough about is what the amygdala does. I mean, you've done some of that work, but there's not a lot of work apart from that, that really taps into what is it that the amygdala is doing upstream in the prefrontal cortex, how it's organizing all the various types of interneurons or within communication within regions of the prefrontal cortex. But the loop is very much there. And I don't think we understand it enough.
Right. The Carter Lab has, done some of that work. Basically, those cells in the amygdala that project to the cortical areas we were talking about, it seems that those cells are the ones
that get it back,
right?
Yeah, exactly. It's like it's actually a loop.
Yeah,
as we're studying brain correlates of things that we can measure behaviorally, like freezing. It seems to me that we spend a lot of time talking about neurons that have no access to the motor neurons, and so there isn't any way out. How does the amygdala frontal cortex circuit that you guys study actually produce a change in behavior?
So partially that's been mapped out. So there are amygdala neurons that project from the one side of it, that's the more cortical side, the basolateral side, into the central nucleus, which is the pathway out into the more brainstem areas like the periaqueductal gray, which then project to out into the spinal cord.
So isn't it the answer to Tony's question, and why does it come back to the amygdala? Because that's the only way to actually alter behavior.
It may be, it may not be, right? Because as far as I understand, it's not only behavior, a fear response, if we want to link it to the human condition, requires also like the visceral internal response, right? Which the central nucleus projects directly into hypothalamic areas and centers to change respiration rates, blood pressure, trigger the HPA axis, right? But as far as
I think you're saying the central nucleus is the final common pathway.
Maybe, but we also know that that's just part of the network.
That's just part of the network. Yeah, the prefrontal also reaches there through its own set of projections.
Because then like the basolateral amygdala and the PFC also project to the nucleus accumbens areas, right? You may think about like links and associations with reward decision making, but also then there's all these pathways, and the pathway you were talking this morning more related to, what is it exactly again?
The output from the infralimbic?
Yeah.
The substantia nominata ventral pallidum pathway. So that one, that's even in the basal forebrain, which then ends up talking to other regions. Right? It's a network. Like, you can't get away from the fact that it's a network.
It just seems like the brain is sort of all management and no laborers. And we study all of these high-level manager neurons that give advice to somebody, and then somebody is actually doing something, and we never studied somebody who's...
The laborers? I feel like the amygdala is partial laborer. It's got some... I feel like it's got qualities of both, actually. It's a little bit got qualities of both. Have you ever studied labor neurons? I'm trying to think of.
No.
I wonder if the neurons that we're now going to go into in the like VPSI are more labor related.
Right. PAG could be.
PAG could be.
Yeah.
Could be more of a labor related section of the brain.
So in this pathway, I don't recall other studies looking at the basal forebrain output of the infralimbic cortex that you are looking at.
Yeah.
So what do we know about that?
So the reason I got interested in it is because there was a paper by Robert Vertes in 2004, which is mapping using interrograde tracer, PHAL, mapping prelimbic and infralimbic outputs across the brain. And one of the major outputs that arises in that paper that almost seems to define the IL is an output to the basal forebrain. And I'm reading this paper and I was like, that's weird. I don't know anything about this pathway and its role in extinction, and like the IL is all about fear suppression. So like, what is even happening here?
Yeah.
So the thing with the basal forebrain is I think the basal forebrain, just due to its kind of anatomically ill-defined, multi-nuclear, not clear defined nuclear anatomy, has not gotten as much attention up until all the genetic stuff, right, has started coming out. And so the cholinergic neurons that can now be manipulated and recorded and defined better, the nuclei that are, the one that's been the best studied is the medial septum, because it communicates with the hippocampus and it's actually kind of well defined, and you can see where it is better, and it's not this like mash of neurons in an unclearly defined way. So, but if you look at the spread of the basal forebrain, like the basal forebrain is a lot of areas, and it's quite wide on the anterior posterior axis, and so I think what people know about it, or people have known about it for a long time, is that it has this attention and salience role in processing information. It's part of the reticular activating, receives inputs from the reticular activating system, and is partaking in wake behaviors. So it fluctuates between wake and sleep, and that's related to obviously attention. And so there's lots of work on cholinergic inputs from the basal forebrain to cortical sites, and how they affect, prolonging depolarization windows for for synaptic plasticity and overlap in time for temporal linking. There's a huge projection into the amygdala, which is upregulated during fear learning and then goes down with extinction, right? So there's this kind of like cholinergic aspect of it. And so that was one kind of reason that I got interested in it. The other thing too is with all the genetic developments, there has been more study of it, right? And so now we do see, so like Christian, right? Christian Barber looked at GABAergic and glutamatergic cells of there and saw that they have these opposing, that some are more involved in, like GABAergic cells of the VPSI are more involved in processing rewarding cues, and the glutamatergic ones are more in the aversive cues. There's been other work also showing that like PD cells, GABAergic PD cells in the basal forebrain stimulate motion and kind of direction towards cues. And then there's other work showing that ventral pallidum processes threat. So it had all the kind of pieces that were there, but no one's ever looked at it. And so it was really partially sort of a like, let's see what this is, like it wasn't necessarily driven by a more deep hypothesis than that.
Would you give us a little rundown on what you found?
Oh, yeah. So basically the finding is that the infralimbic projection to the basal forebrain becomes more active during active extinction learning, and its role is really just to constrain defensive behavior during this extinction learning and help it go down and constrain it without really taking part in memory formation or some sort of long-term process.
Extinction is such a cool feature of that, learned fear experiments, and there's so much known about it. Maybe you would tell us a little something about extinction. Like by default, we think of extinction as just sort of forgetting fear, but it's not. It's
right.
It's sort of overriding.
It's overriding. Yeah, it's an example of overriding. Yeah. Yeah. So
we need it. We need extinction to learn to not be afraid of everything, to only be afraid of the things that we should be afraid of, right? That's how we do it. And it's really learning to not be afraid of stuff.
It's the basis of exposure therapy, right?
So you might think that, learning to be afraid or learning not be afraid would probably use the same brain regions, but what you see are some differences between the brain regions that are important for acquisition versus the ones that are important for extinction.
I think you probably need to harness more of the brain for extinction. I think it's a harder learning. And, anything that you have to learn on top of the thing that you already learned, right, is going to be a harder learning about the same thing, right? It's like, now we're changing course. It used to be this thing. Now it's this thing. And moreover, it used to be not only this thing, but used to be this really bad thing, and now it's not. And so it's really overcoming. I really think you have to harness more. I don't know if you found the same thing.
Yes, so I'm looking at those things from the perspective of sleep and some ideas of what sleep is doing for emotional processing. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that sleep both affects the acquisition, but also the extinction. And I would even say that the effects on extinction maybe even more robust.
Really?
Yeah. You would find interesting effects of sleep, particularly REM sleep, on acquisition, but it wouldn't be that surprising to see effects in both directions, right? Sometimes REM sleep would seem to be rendering the amygdala less sensitive and reduce fear recall or reduce acquisition that is about to come, and sometimes it increases it. So it's really not necessarily consistent. While we're talking about extinction, it seems like REM sleep helps extinction, right? Helps extinction recall in a more consistent way. But
REM sleep specifically, the REM stage.
Most of the time, yeah. Not all experiments are able to differentiate between the different sleep stages. Some are looking at sleep as a whole, but those that looked at specific sleep stages usually find REM sleep to be the one that is most effective. The idea, there's several theories about that. One that I particularly partial of is that there's some levels of norepinephrine that are required in order to have an amygdala that is not too sensitive and selective enough, and be in that position as you described, that it's pretty quiet most of the time, and then something salient happens in an environment and poof, right, tells you, oh, look at that. While if norepinephrine levels are too high, then it has this chatter. It has this kind of tonic activity that makes any phasic response less obvious, right?
Yeah.
The signal to noise is reduced. And the idea is, and there's some evidence to suggest that during REM sleep there is resetting of norepinephrine levels to a level that is more workable, and that kind of allows you to wake up with a fresh amygdala that is ready to go and have that signal-to-noise ratio that you want. That's one model which I'm finding interesting, but I'm wondering if, from your experience, would you say that excessive activation of the amygdala, I don't know, like for example, if you're in a very stressful positions, or like your job or in military, would cause it to be more noisy, regular. Like you can use the amygdala too much just because of the environment that you are in, that would create systemic problems that would be solved very easily.
I'm trying to imagine a noisy amygdala. So a noisy amygdala meaning that it has high responses more often.
Yeah, the threshold would be reduced.
Both, like the baseline activity increases, and then also those cells, for some reason, they become more responsive. I have done some recordings in rats with undergoing like restraint stress, and that's exactly what happens. Both basal activity and tone-induced or cue-induced activity gets enhanced.
All of it, right?
All of it in the basolateral, at least.
Because of sustained stress.
Yeah.
Well, the stress increases dendritic
arborization,
dendritic arborization and spines.
And elevates the norepinephrine.
Elevates norepinephrine, right?
And these changes are like lasting?
They're lasting.
Yeah,
they're lasting.
For how long?
At least I have measured up to 60 days after stress exposure, and still elevated amygdala activity is there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I wonder, I don't know if anybody, I'm like more examining, I'm like researching humans, but I wonder if anybody has ever looked over a sustained period, like 60 days, whether sleep helps reduce it back.
Right.
I don't know.
Can I recall any study now? Perhaps, Roger Pittman's, Lisa Sheen's group may have something about it.
Where sleep brings it back, meaning the manipulation would involve manipulating the amount of sleep that they're getting.
For example, or maybe even just looking at, I don't know if there's enough variability in REM sleep in rodents, but if there is, maybe those that just naturally get more REM sleep would show like a faster decrease to baseline after having sustained stress.
I actually we had some mice that had undergone chronic stress, and we used them for safety learning study. And then I was like, I'm actually interested in sleep, and I want to record some sleep, just regular, not, don't want to do anything. Yeah. And so we had stressed and unstressed mice, and we put them into this little box. I mean, it was like a 20 centimeter by 30 centimeter little box, and turned the lights low and left them alone for an hour.
Buried alive, kind of.
Yeah, and I was like, just do whatever you want to do, and hopefully you sleep.
Yeah.
Nobody slept. Nobody slept for an hour. Nothing. No sleeping was happening. What we ended up having is non-stressed animals just sort of exploring and hanging out and exploring that whole space, and the stressed animals avoiding the center and treating it as if it's this open field test, which it wasn't. It was like in the dark, small little area. And so we're looking at it now because I have, cell recordings and amygdala and stuff recordings in this task. But that was the goal, is to look at sleep.
How do you measure sleep?
So we were going to use local field potentials to do, to separate them out for power.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
At least we can see some commonalities in, even from humans and animal research, which is, like there's elevated norepinephrine signals, amygdala signals, dorsal PFC activity, combined with reduced ventral PFC activity, producing states of mental disease, right? Even affecting sleep. But sleep should be part of the, healthy brain and trying to bring everything back to normal.
What we did actually, I'm remembering a study we did with Denis a while ago, was we looked at sleep in cats after fear conditioning, and we recorded it for hours. We just recorded theta oscillations in the amygdala. Yeah. And what you see is upregulated theta oscillations in the amygdala post fear conditioning for a long time.
And during sleep?
During sleep, yeah. And I don't remember what that looked like. I don't remember us separating out sleep stages, actually.
Right. There's always a question of whether sleep is affecting the fear acquisition and later on fear recall, or is it the fear that affects sleep, right? Which direction it goes? It probably goes both ways. In the past, one of the main symptoms of PTSD is sleep disruption. Some people call it even the hallmark of PTSD.
Yeah.
But a lot of research has been focused recently on whether sleep contributes to begin with to the development of PTSD. So it's not just a result of the stress, but it's something about the sleep that people had after the trauma could lead to increased chances of developing PTSD. And what I'm looking at is even looking before that on baseline sleep, like your habitual sleep, does that increases the chances of developing PTSD, of being especially sensitive when you experience a trauma to begin with. So the other direction, right, where sleep is contributing to kind of aberrant stress response is what I'm particularly interested in.
So are you looking at the architecture of sleep, like in terms of the sleep stage distribution?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
And I think, sleep has been one of those topics that we've been kind of, trying to give some information or get some information about it. But I mean, just the difficulties behind, doing these very prolonged studies, in animals or even humans, you cannot just tell them, okay, now fall asleep, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to record from your brain, right? It just doesn't happen that quickly. But I think, getting more information about how sleep is changing, just overall oscillations, not only throughout the brain, but in particular networks. I was watching some documentaries by neuroscientists specialized in sleep the other day, talking about, very strong oscillations in between thalamic and visual cortex during sleep and how that
although probably
modulates, dreaming.
During REM sleep though, or during other sleep
dreaming
stages?
At least, he
dreaming.
was talking to. And how that, links into the PTSD spectrum, and later on how that affects, the behavior of the individual, right, and the whole mental state. I think, there's a lot here, that we could continue.
That's really interesting.
Forever.
Why specifically REM? I'm just curious. Or not necessarily REM for you, or your other stages.
You mean what I'm interested in general, or or specifically why am I looking at REM in relation to fear?
In relation to fear,
because it has been documented many times over the last 20 years that this is the specific sleep state. I'm not looking only at REM. When I'm measuring sleep, I would measure all sleep stages, and I would try to see if there's any kind of associations between a particular sleep stage and the measurements of fear conditioning that I'm looking at. But both from my experience and from my research and previous studies, REM sleep is definitely the stage where things seem to be most affecting in relation to emotional learning in general and fear learning in particular. It's interesting because I actually had a study a while ago, a grant that was supposed to look at why isn't it emotional memory affected by other sleep stages. Like memory in general is actually known to be affected at least to the same degree or even more by other sleep stages, like slow wave sleep.
Right.
So there's the reason that emotional memory would also be affected by slow wave sleep. I had all kind of findings in this grant, but nothing was related to slow wave sleep. It was all REM. Does the brain know that when something is attached to a strong emotional signal, let an other sleep stage handle it?
Yeah.
Or is there some other reason? Maybe you just, it's concealed somehow? I don't know. But if you look at the literature, human literature that I'm much more familiar with, you'll be hard-pressed to find a connection between other sleep stages and emotional memory.
I have a very primitive question. The idea is extinction, the role of extinction is to refine the brain's theory about what's scary in the world. And so But as more and more things get extinguished, the brain gets a more and more incisive theory about what to be afraid of and what not to be afraid of. So extinction is a kind of learning, as you say. So you should learn it by experience. It should be when you're awake and doing things that you learn that. And then, of course, sleep would affect how well you remember that later.
Right.
We know that happens with all kinds of learning.
Right.
So how do we view, you said slow wave sleep is what helps us consolidate memory, right?
Mm-hmm.
So slow wave sleep maybe ought to help us consolidate extinction as well. Do we have any idea why that would even happen in the first place?
There are studies in which, in animals, after extinction, if you do sleep disruption, those animals have difficulty consolidating.
So they forgot
extinction.
The extinction, yeah.
They kind of forget, and basically there's rebound. But I think also, it kind of talks about what is actually extinction all about. If for primordial functions for survival, extinction doesn't make sense.
Right.
It actually doesn't make sense to forget that something is dangerous.
Well, you don't ever forget it. I don't think you ever forget it, but it does allow you to explore
also,
and reach like food and forage.
Right, but also, like that excessive fear needs to be controlled somehow, and that's the modulatory role of extinction as opposed to completely get rid of the emotional response.
Yeah. No. Yeah, it definitely doesn't get rid of the emotional response. That's never...
Right.
I sometimes think that when we're doing experiments, we usually manipulate things in a very straightforward manner which reduces the complexity of the world to something simple that we can control. But the world is much more sophisticated than that. And I would imagine that the amygdala or the prefrontal cortex, they're not there in order to make very simple and easy distinctions between fear this, don't fear that. It's probabilistic and it's probably have multi-dimensions, and I think that that's why you need sophisticated machinery like the brain. And I also think that sleep contributes to something that might be fine-tuning those kind of this kind of information that you collect of what you should be, what is a threat and what is not a threat, and maybe you should kind of like take many things in consideration from previous information that might not be even relevant or doesn't seem to be relevant in order to shape up the exact pattern of what you consider to be threatening and safety. And so extinguishing something it makes sense as long as you don't really forget it, but it's just one more step in your constant attempt to fine-tune what you know in order to be most adaptive.
But I do wonder if extinction, the ability to extinguish with experience, as you suggest, actually gets better, right? Where the more you do it, the better you get at it.
But that's not the case, at least, in mental disease, right? We know that
right.
they need to keep undergoing exposure therapy over and over and over. And we, from the animal world, we know that just simple things as just wait long enough and the fear memory comes back. And extinction training, even if you do loads of extinction training, they reduce the fear responses for a little while, but the initial
or any sort of reinstatement, or any sort of renewal,
context-based renewal. So
I would ask, what is better? What is exactly being better in
than extinction?
Or what is mean to get better in extinguishing things, right? Because maybe some things are worth extinguishing and some things are not. So actually, if you get too much of it, right, you're in jeopardy somehow.
Right.
You have to get it just exactly right.
Perhaps if we could ask just one more question. What do you think is better, extinction or safe learning?
My favorite question.
We haven't touched that topic yet.
Thank you, Tony.
Okay, that's such a cool topic, and we could do that. Have another podcast.
Another podcast. It's cutting that question off.
This will be a good place for us to stop.
Okay.
Okay.
So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you.
And this has been Neuroscientists Talk Shop.